Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. 24 years after the night they threw me out, I stared at the front porch camera. The father who tossed his pregnant 17-year-old daughter into the cold stood there in a bespoke suit. His first words lacked any apology. "We need to see her," he demanded. They thought my child was their salvation, a secret to save their crumbling empire. I am no longer that shivering girl. I will let them in, only to lock them inside their ruin. My name is Aaliyah Fox. I am 41 years old, standing in the center of my glass-walled living room in Denver, watching the ghosts of my past materialize on a head-of security monitor. It has been 24 years since they erased me from their lives. Now they are standing on my front porch. The chime of the perimeter alert cuts through the silence of the house. I do not flinch. I just stare at the screen. Dorian and Lenora Fox look older, the sharp edges of their Kentucky aristocracy softened by time and perhaps desperation, but the arrogant posture remains. Dorian wears a bespoke charcoal suit, the fabric impeccable, while Lenora stands slightly behind him, her face pulled tight into a mask of rehearsed composure. I press the intercom button, allowing only the sound of my breathing to filter through the speaker. I expect a greeting. I expect a lie disguised as an apology. I expect the standard manipulation of a father pretending to miss his daughter. Instead, Dorian leans toward the speaker, his voice a dry, growly command that carries no warmth. He does not ask how I am. He does not say he is sorry. He says exactly what he came to say. "We need to see the granddaughter before it is too late." The words hit the glass, sliding down like dirty rain. He does not call her my child. He calls her the granddaughter, a sudden asset he wishes to claim. The sheer audacity of his demand pulls me backward through time, violently ripping me out of my safe Denver home and throwing me straight down onto the polished mahogany floors of the past. 24 years ago, Briar Glen, Kentucky. Briar Glen is the kind of wealthy conservative town where the paint on the grand colonnades is always fresh. The lawns are manicured with mathematical precision, and family reputation is the only currency that truly matters. In Briar Glen, a scandal is not a tragedy. It is a disease you must cut out before it infects the neighborhood. Our family, the Fox family, was royalty in that suffocating little kingdom. I was 17 years old, a young African-American girl, trembling in the center of my father's oppressive wood-paneled study. The air in that room always smelled of expensive leather, aged scotch, and absolute authority. I stood before the massive oak desk, my hands clamped together so tightly my knuckles itched, trying to force the words past the thick knot of terror in my throat. "I am pregnant," I whispered. The silence that followed was not the quiet of shock. It was the terrifying, heavy stillness of a predator assessing a sudden change in the wind. I confessed the rest, the words spilling out of me in pathetic, broken sobs. The father was Rowan Wren, a boy who worked part-time shifts at the local auto garage. His hands were always stained with motor oil, his smile gentle, his background entirely unacceptable to the Fox family dynasty. I expected my parents to scream. I braced myself for the shattering of glass, the roar of my father's legendary temper, the sharp sting of my mother's verbal abuse. I would have welcomed the screaming. Anger would have meant they felt something, that beneath the rage there was still a pulse of parental concern. But Dorian and Lenora Fox did not rage. They operated with a chilling corporate efficiency. Looking at them was like watching a board of directors decide how to liquidate a defective subsidiary. My father sat back in his high leather chair, steepling his fingers. His eyes, cold and dark, assessed me not as a daughter in crisis, but as a liability. "That thing inside you is not just a mistake," Aaliyah, Dorian said, his voice flat and measured. "It is a threat. It is a calculated strike against everything I have built. Do you understand what a mechanic boy will do to the Foxbridge community's brand? Do you have any idea how this jeopardizes your brother Beckett and his political future? You are a walking ruin." He spoke of his real estate empire and my golden boy brother as if they were the Holy Trinity, and I was the heretic bringing fire to their temple. I turned my desperate eyes to my mother, begging for a fraction of maternal mercy. Lenora sat on the velvet sofa, her posture rigidly perfect, her gaze fixed on the marble fireplace. "Mom, please," I begged. Lenora did not look at me. She stood up smoothly, walked over to the mantelpiece, and reached for the silver-framed family portrait resting in the center. Without a single word of defense or comfort, she simply took the photograph down and placed it face down on the cold stone. As if I had already died in that house, she handled the eraser with a terrifying calm, effectively announcing that I was no longer a person. I was a problem that had been solved. Dorian opened a side drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope and tossed it across the polished wood. It slid and stopped just inches from my trembling hands. "There is cash in there," Dorian said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. "Enough to get you far away from Briar Glen. There is also a bus ticket. I do not care where it goes as long as it is not here." I stared at the envelope, my vision blurring with hot, stinging tears. "You are throwing me out," I choked out, my voice cracking into a pathetic squeak. "If you walk through that front door tonight," Dorian replied, turning his back to me to pour a glass of bourbon, "you are no longer a fox. You will never contact us. You will never claim our name. You are entirely, permanently on your own." The absolute finality in his tone shattered the last fragile illusion I had about my family. They did not love me. They had only ever loved the reflection of themselves that I provided. And now the mirror was broken. I took the envelope. My fingers were numb as I turned away from the man who sired me and the woman who birthed me. I walked out of the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, severing my bloodline with the finality of a guillotine. I moved through the massive silent hallways of the house, heading toward my bedroom to gather whatever I could carry. But as I passed the hall table, my eyes caught a small tarnished brass key hidden beneath a decorative porcelain bowl. My grandmother, Maeve Fox, had slipped that key into my palm just days before she passed away. She had pressed it into my hand with cold, urgent fingers, whispering that the men in this family built their castles on quicksand and one day I would need a way to pull myself free. I had not understood her then. I had kept the key hidden, a meaningless trinket from a dying woman. But in that moment, as I was being discarded like trash, a strange instinct flared in my chest. I grabbed the key, slipping it deep into the pocket of my coat. I did not know what it unlocked, but I knew it was the only piece of this house that truly belonged to me. I packed a single duffel bag. I did not take the expensive jewelry or the designer clothes they had bought me to fit their image. I only took what I could carry on my shoulders. The Kentucky night was brutally cold, the wind howling through the manicured oak trees. As I stepped out onto the grand front porch, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me. The lock engaged with a loud metallic crack. I stood there in the freezing darkness, my hand resting on my flat stomach, feeling the terrifying weight of the universe pressing down on my 17-year-old shoulders. I was homeless, pregnant, and utterly alone. The fear was paralyzing, a cold poison sinking into my bones. But beneath the terror, a tiny glowing ember of pure rage began to catch fire. I gripped the handle of my duffel bag and began to walk down the long winding driveway. I did not look back at the mansion. I did not shed another tear for the people inside it. With every step I took away from Briar Glen, the frightened child inside me withered and died, replaced by something much harder, much colder. I swore an oath to the dark sky that night. I promised myself that I would survive. I promised that I would build my own fortress brick by brutal brick. And most importantly, I swore that one day I would never again stand on a porch begging them to open a door. One day they would come crawling to mine. And now, 24 years later, staring at the security monitor in my Denver home, watching Dorian and Lenora Fox stand on my front porch, I know the time has come to collect on that promise. The diesel engine of the Greyhound bus hummed a relentless, grinding vibration into my spine for 2,000 miles. Every mile pulling me away from the manicured lawns of my hometown felt like peeling tape off an open wound. I had no destination, no safety net, and no plan. All I possessed was a crumpled diner napkin clutched in my fist. A waitress with tired eyes and a stained apron had slid it across the counter during a brief layover in Kansas, pressing my cold fingers shut around it after noticing my swollen belly and bruised expression. It was an address in Denver, Colorado. I arrived in the city with exactly $42 to my name and the clothes on my back. The altitude made my chest tight, and the sharp autumn air bit right through my thin cotton jacket. Juniper House stood at the end of a dead-end street, a sprawling, weather-beaten Victorian structure with peeling gray paint and a sagging front porch. It did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress for the forgotten, a sanctuary for women the world had chewed up and spit out on the sidewalk. A heavy oak door opened before I could even raise my hand to knock. Odessa Vale filled the frame. She was a tall, imposing woman with hair the color of iron and dark eyes that had seen too much ruin to ever be surprised by another broken girl on her doorstep. She did not offer sweet words or gentle pity. She looked at my stomach, then up at my shaking hands, and finally met my gaze. She ushered me inside, handed me a bowl of hot chicken stew, pointed to a narrow cot in the corner of a drafty shared room, and tossed a heavy wool blanket over my shivering shoulders. "Hurt first," Odessa told me, her voice like cracked leather. "Collapse later if you need to. Cry until you have nothing left. But tomorrow morning, you have to get up and you have to work." Tomorrow morning came, and so did the crushing reality of survival. I did not have the luxury of grief or the time to mourn the family that had discarded me. I took whatever jobs Odessa could CRE for me in the neighborhood. For months, I worked the graveyard shift at a desolate self-fest storage facility on the edge of the city. I sat in a tiny unheated toll booth from 10 at night until 6:00 in the morning, shivering under layers of thrift store coats, jumping at every strange noise in the dark. When the sun came up, I took a second job scrubbing baseboards and cleaning toilets in vacant apartment complexes until my knuckles bled and the harsh chemical smell of bleach settled permanently in the back of my throat. But it was the third job that planted the seed of my entire future. Odessa had an arrangement with a small rundown land records office downtown. They needed cheap, off-the-books labor for data entry, transferring old paper files into a primitive digital system. I sat in a windowless basement room for 5 hours a day, my lower back screaming from the weight of the late-stage pregnancy, staring at endless columns of dense legal text, mortgages, deeds of trust, liens, foreclosure notices, quitclaim deeds. At first, it was just alphabet soup, a blur of boring administrative jargon. But as the winter dragged on and my due date approached, my mind began to sharpen. I needed to understand what I was typing. I studied for my general equivalency diploma during my 15-minute lunch breaks, eating stale sandwiches while memorizing math formulas. In the quiet hours of the night shift at the storage facility, I read copies of the property files I had taken from the office. I learned how signatures moved massive assets from one hand to another. I learned how a single strategically placed clause in a contract could render an entire family homeless overnight. I realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that paper could kill a person just as effectively as a loaded weapon. The wealthy people of the world did not need to resort to physical violence to destroy someone. They used ink, stamps, and legal loopholes. The physical toll of carrying the baby while working 3 jobs was immense. My body felt like a rented room I could no longer afford to maintain. When the labor finally started on a freezing Tuesday morning, it was violent, agonizing, and endless. It lasted for 36 brutal hours. The hospital room in the county charity ward was bright, sterile, and indifferent to my suffering. I pushed until the blood vessels in my eyes burst, until the heart monitor screamed, until I was absolutely certain my own heart was going to stop beating. Then the crying pierced the sterile air. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a shock of thick dark hair, and powerful lungs that demanded the world yield to her existence. But as I held her warm, fragile body against my exhausted, sweating chest, the crushing weight of reality crashed down on me and shattered my ribs. I had nothing. My bank account held less than $100. The medical debt from the complicated emergency delivery was already mounting into the tens of thousands. Juniper House was a wonderful haven for me, but it was no place to raise a vulnerable infant. There was a draft in the walls. The heater constantly failed, and the neighborhood was dangerous. My future was a black gaping hole. I spent 3 agonizing days staring at the cracked plaster ceiling of the hospital ward, holding my daughter, feeling the deepest, most suffocating maternal love violently colliding with absolute paralyzing terror. I could be selfish. I could keep her. We could starve together. We could freeze together. We could live on the absolute jagged edge of disaster, always just one missed paycheck away from sleeping on the concrete streets. Or I could break my own heart beyond repair to save hers. The decision felt like surrendering a part of myself with nothing to ease the pain. Through a relentless legal advocate that Odesser knew and trusted, I chose the path of an open, strictly legal adoption. I read through dozens of thick applicant files until I found them. Nora and Sealer's heart. They were a kind, quiet, middle-class couple, deeply in love, financially stable, and utterly shattered by 10 years of failed fertility treatments. They did not want to replace me. They just desperately wanted to be parents. They had a house with a yard. They had college funds ready. They had everything I did not. I agreed to the terms, but I demanded one absolute non-negotiable condition etched into the very center of the legal contract. I would write letters to my daughter. Those letters were to be kept unread and unsealed in a secure legal trust and given to her only when she was 18 years old. I named her Cora. It meant maiden, a new beginning. The day before the final handover, I sat at the chipped wooden kitchen table in Juniper House and wrote the very first letter. My tears dropped onto the paper, smearing the blue ink. I did not write to beg for her future forgiveness. I wrote to tell her the brutal truth. I promised her that I was not walking away because I lacked love for her. I was walking away because I lacked the power to protect her from a cruel world. I swore to her right there on the paper that I would spend every single waking moment of my life building myself into a lethal weapon. And one day, when I was finally strong enough, she would know my name, not as a tragic story of abandonment, but as an impenetrable shield. I folded the paper, slid it into a thick envelope, and handed it to Odesser. She took the massive stack of adoption papers, the legal agreements, and my letter, placing them all inside a heavy fireproof steel safe hidden behind her office desk. She turned the metal dial, the heavy internal clank sealing my past away in the dark. She turned back to me, her rough, calloused hands gripping my trembling shoulders tightly. "You did not lose her, Aaliyah," Odesser said, her voice fiercely absolute. "You are buying her time to live in safety." The next morning, when Nora and Sealers came to take Cora away, the sky was a bruised, heavy shade of gray. I stood on the porch of Juniper House and watched their sedan pull away, disappearing down the street until it was nothing but a speck of metal in the distance. My arms were empty. My chest felt like it had been hollowed out with a rusted blade. I walked to the small dirt patch behind the boarding house, where a single struggling fern sat in a cracked clay pot. In my right hand, I held the thin plastic identification bracelet they had snapped onto my wrist at the hospital. I knelt in the dirt, my knees sinking into the damp, cold soil. I dug a deep hole with my bare fingers, tearing my nails. I buried the plastic band deep into the earth and packed the dirt tightly over it, sealing it away. I stood up, wiping the wet soil on my faded jeans. The 17-year-old girl who had been terrified, helpless, and discarded was dead. I had buried her right there alongside my hospital band. I swore to the freezing Denver wind that my life would not simply be a monument to a desperate, agonizing decision. I was going to learn exactly how to read the paper that the wealthy used to ruin lives, and I was going to write my own violent ending. I did not build my new life on a foundation of luck or sudden miracles. I built it on a relentless, obsessive understanding of how the legal system conceals its darkest sins within the margins of ordinary documents. Odesser became my most ruthless professor. She did not teach me how to smile or how to network in high society. She taught me the anatomy of a property deed. We spent thousands of hours in the dim, flickering light of her back office, surrounded by mountains of dusty manila folders. She showed me how to trace a chain of title back through 50 years of history. She taught me how to spot a fractional discrepancy in a signature across 3 different warranty deeds, proving forgery without ever needing a confession. We dissected shitey bonds, exploited probate loopholes, and mapped out the exact legal pathways that allowed wealthy families to siphon assets legally from the vulnerable while keeping their tailored suits completely spotless. I traded sleep for education for 4 solid years. I attended night classes at a local community college, running on cheap black coffee and sheer spite. I earned my advanced paralegal certificate, passing every single examination with perfect marks. But I did not stop there. I transitioned into the aggressive maladominated sectors of property dispute resolution, forensic mortgage auditing, and the investigation of complex construction fraud. I learned that corrupt developers often hid their cut corners not on the construction site, but in the subclauses of massive, unreadable zoning applications. The corporate legal world in Denver quickly learned my name. I developed a reputation for a very specific, terrifying skill. I did not just discover who was telling a lie. I could drop a 500-page binder on a mahogany conference table and point to the exact line on the exact page on the exact date where the perjury was born. I made seasoned opposing counsels sweat through their expensive dress shirts without ever raising my voice. When I had amassed enough capital and an ironclad reputation, I walked away from the firm I was working for and founded my own enterprise. I called it Iron Veil Claims Group. The name was a permanent tribute to the woman who gave me shelter and the strength I forged in the dark. My firm specialized in one brutal, highly complex niche. We rescued desperate homeowners, disenfranchised elderly citizens, and broken families who had been swallowed whole by predatory real estate syndicates. We tore apart shady eviction notices and fraudulent foreclosure proceedings. The firm expanded at an explosive rate in less than 3 years. We grew from a two-person operation in a rented strip mall office to a multi-million-dollar enterprise occupying the top floor of a downtown high-rise building. We employed 20 investigators and a dozen ruthless attorneys. My success was not born of charisma or charm. It was born of an absolute chilling competence. I never yelled during a mediation session. I never engaged in theatrical courtroom posturing. I simply walked into the room, placed my meticulously compiled evidence on the desk, and delivered a conclusion so structurally sound that it silenced the entire room. Opposing lawyers learned quickly that when a Lear Fox handed them a settlement offer, they had better sign it before the sun went down. Despite the rapid accumulation of wealth, the custom designer suits, and the quiet power I wielded across the state, I never forgot the promise I made in that boarding house kitchen. Every single year on her birthday, I locked the door to my corner office, poured a single glass of cold water, and wrote a letter to Carr. I poured my quiet victories, my profound regrets, and my enduring affection into those crisp white pages. I sent them to the legal trust, knowing they would sit unread until her 18th birthday. I never demanded a response. I never tried to breach the strict terms of the open adoption agreement. I had to learn the hardest lesson a mother could ever endure. I learned how to let my love stand entirely still, offering absolute devotion without a single ounce of possession. She was growing up somewhere under the same sky, and my job was simply to make sure the world she walked in was safer because I was tearing down the predators in it. The turning point arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. I was sitting alone at my massive glass desk reviewing a massive portfolio of distressed commercial debt my firm was considering acquiring from a failing regional bank. I scrolled through endless rows of corporate entities, limited liability companies, and holding trusts. The spreadsheet contained thousands of rows of bad loans and toxic assets. Then my eyes locked onto a sequence of letters that made the blood instantly freeze in my veins. Foxbridge Communities. The name glowed on the high-resolution monitor, a sudden violent intrusion of a past I thought I had locked away forever. It was not just a random corporate debtor buried in a spreadsheet. It was the empire my parents had chosen over my existence. I stopped breathing for 10 full seconds. I highlighted the row and began pulling the associated public filings, tax records, and collateral descriptions. Looking at the messy, convoluted financial structures attached to the file, a brilliant, terrifying realization washed over me. This company was not just the reason I was banished into the freezing rain. It was a sprawling monument to financial instability. The debt profile suggested they were drowning in leveraged loans and hidden liabilities. It meant they were vulnerable. It meant that the impenetrable fortress my father had bragged about in his study 24 years ago was actually built on a foundation of rotting wood. Suddenly, I understood that Foxbridge Communities was the gateway leading directly back to the night they cast me out. And it was the exact reason they would soon pay a price far greater than the mere loss of a daughter. They had not just broken a family, they had broken the law. I stood up from my desk, my pulse beating a slow, steady rhythm of war in my throat. I walked across the plush carpet to the biometric safe built into the solid wall of my office. I pressed my right thumb against the scanner. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying clunk. I bypassed the stacks of emergency cash, the encrypted hard drives, and the sensitive client dossers. I reached all the way to the very back of the bottom shelf and pulled out a small faded velvet pouch. I opened the drawstrings and tipped the contents into my open palm. The small tarnished brass key that my grandmother Maeve had pressed into my hand right before she died caught the pale overhead light. For over 2 decades I had carried it simply as a heavy, sorrowful keepsake from the only person in that house who had ever looked at me with genuine kindness. But looking at it now, with the impending financial ruin of Foxbridge Communities glowing on my computer screen behind me, a profound and dangerous clarity struck me. This was never meant to be a sentimental memory. Maeve had known what my father was. She had known the rot spreading beneath the floorboards of the family legacy. I gripped the cold brass tightly in my fist, the jagged edges pressing into my skin. It was not a keepsake. It was the very first piece of evidence in a trial I was finally ready to prosecute. The glow of the monitors illuminated my office long after the cleaning staff had gone home. For 3 consecutive nights, I did not sleep. I ordered black coffee and meticulously peeled back the layers of my family's financial history. The public narrative of Foxbridge Communities was a meticulously crafted fairy tale. Dorian presented himself to the local press and country club investors as a visionary, a self-made titan of real estate who built his fortune through sheer grit and unmatched business acumen. The public records told a vastly different story. I bypassed the current bloated portfolio and dug straight down to the bedrock, hunting for the initial capital injection that launched his first major suburban development. I accessed the county clerk archives pulling digitized microfiche from over 2 decades ago. The initial funding did not come from a savvy bank loan or a brilliant partnership. The foundational equity for Foxbridge Communities was secured by a massive commercial mortgage, and the collateral for that mortgage was a sprawling 75-acre parcel of prime undeveloped land located in Beamer County. I pulled the original deed for the Belmere property. My eyes traced the heavy black ink of the grantor and grantee. The land did not belong to my father. It belonged to me. My grandmother Maeve had executed a secret courtal to her will just months before she died. She knew exactly what kind of predator her son was. She had bypassed Dorian entirely, placing the most valuable piece of her estate directly into a blind trust with my name as the sole beneficiary. It was her final desperate attempt to give me a shield against the exact man who ended up destroying me. But I was 17 years old at the time of her death. I was a minor in the state of Kentucky. Transferring or leveraging a minor's major asset required a stringent legal process. It required a probate judge to sign off, a court-appointed guardian to evaluate the risk, and a signed affidavit of consent from the ward. I navigated to the probate filings from that specific year. I downloaded the guardian approval packet. My breath hitched in my throat. There, on the bottom of a sworn affidavit legally releasing the Beamer land to be used as collateral by Dorian, was my signature. I zoomed in on the digital document until the blue ink blurred into pixels. It was a spectacular forgery. The slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen. It looked exactly like the handwriting of a naive 17-year-old girl, but the date stamped by the notary public next to the signature was the absolute proof of the lie. The document was executed and notarized on the 3rd week of November. On that exact date, I was not standing in a warm law office in Kentucky. I was thousands of miles away, curled up in the freezing back row of a Greyhound bus, staring blindly out the window at the bleak Colorado landscape, terrified and alone. The realization did not make me angry. It made me absolutely still. The silence in my office was deafening as the pieces of a 24-year-old puzzle finally snapped together. The night my parents threw me out into the freezing rain was never about moral outrage. It was never about the scandal of a teenage pregnancy or the preservation of the family reputation. The pregnancy was merely a convenient excuse. It was the perfect smoke screen to forcefully remove the primary title holder from the premises. They needed me gone. They needed me entirely disconnected from the family attorneys and the local courts so I could not contest the probate filing. They evicted me, effectively clearing the crime scene so they could legally steal the only asset my grandmother had tried to use to save my life. My father had literally bankrolled his entire empire using the stolen inheritance of the daughter he threw away. The instinct of any normal attorney would be to immediately draft a massive civil lawsuit. I had the forgery. I had the timeline. I could file an injunction the very next morning, freeze their assets, and drag Dorian into a federal courtroom for severe financial fraud. I could win millions of dollars in a settlement. But I did not want a settlement. A settlement would allow them to quietly declare bankruptcy, restructure their assets, and retreat to a comfortable retirement while maintaining their pristine social standing. I did not want to win a lawsuit. I wanted to execute a flawless demolition. I closed the probate file and opened a secure encrypted portal. I utilized the vast untraceable resources of Iron Veil Claims Group to begin a highly sophisticated siege. I established 3 separate corporate shell entities registered in Delaware and Wyoming, shielding my identity completely. Through these invisible companies, I began to systematically purchase the secondary debt of Foxbridge communities. I bought up their delinquent promissory notes. I acquired the recourse rights from frustrated regional lenders. I quietly purchased secured shares and mezzanine loans that were slowly suffocating my father's liquidity. I became the invisible noose around his neck. As I acquired more of their internal financial data through these debt purchases, the true horrifying scale of Dorian's corruption became clear. The forgery was just the genesis. The entire company was a sprawling Ponzi scheme of real estate. He was utilizing a highly illegal model of cross-collateralization. He would secure a loan for one property, then use that same property to fraudulently secure capital for a second project. Furthermore, he was using my brother Beckett as a pawn. Beckett owned a supposedly independent property management firm. Dorian was drafting internal contracts with Beckett, artificially inflating the appraisal values of Foxbridge properties and selling them back and forth between their entities to create millions of dollars in phantom equity. They were printing fake money on paper to satisfy their institutional investors. But the most damning discovery was hidden inside the permit filings for their newest, most celebrated endeavor. Foxbridge was currently soliciting tens of millions of dollars to complete a massive state-of-the-art assisted living facility for the elderly. It was meant to be their crown jewel. I obtained the confidential structural engineering reports that had been buried deep within the municipal zoning applications. The reports were catastrophic. The foundation of the nursing home was severely compromised. The soil composition had been ignored to save money, resulting in massive subsidence. The concrete, load-bearing walls were already showing critical stress fractures before the roof was even completely installed. Dorian knew the building was structurally unsound. The internal emails I legally subpoenaed through my shell companies proved it. But instead of halting construction and remediating the deadly flaws, Foxbridge was actively covering it up. They were falsifying inspection reports to keep the investment capital flowing. They were perfectly willing to move hundreds of vulnerable elderly citizens into a collapsing building just to prevent their financial house of cards from falling apart. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the panoramic view of the Denver skyline. If I struck now, I would win a legal victory. But if I waited for the absolute perfect moment, I could collapse the entire narrative of lies that had fed and sheltered that family for over 2 decades. I held the power to not just take their money, but to strip away their freedom, their legacy, and their name in front of the entire world. They did not just steal my youth. They built their entire empire on my name. The heavy mahogany door swung open, and the ghosts of my past stepped over the threshold of my Denver home. The air in my living room immediately shifted, thickening with the familiar, suffocating scent of my father's imported cologne and my mother's expensive floral perfume. For 24 years, I had prepared for this exact moment, building my armor piece by piece. But seeing Dorian and Lenora Fox standing in my foyer still sent a phantom chill down my spine. They looked older, their faces lined with the undeniable map of time and stress, but their predatory instincts remained perfectly intact. They did not look around with awe at the floor toe-ceiling windows or the expensive modern art lining the walls. Instead, their eyes darted across the room, rapidly calculating the square footage, assessing the value of the imported Italian leather furniture, and recalibrating their approach. They had expected to find a struggling, broken woman. Instead, they found a fortress. I gestured toward the sitting area. I did not offer a hug. I did not offer a smile. I simply sat in the armchair opposite them, crossing my legs, waiting for the performance to begin. They sat close together on the sofa. Dorian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands in a gesture designed to look vulnerable. He did not start with an apology for throwing me out into the freezing night. He bypassed the trauma entirely, utilizing a soft, remarkably gentle tone that I had not heard since I was a small child. He spoke of the relentless passage of time. He mentioned a recent health scare, a minor arterial blockage that had supposedly forced him to reevaluate his legacy. Lenora placed a manicured hand over his, sighing heavily, playing the role of the devoted, weary matriarch. They spun a beautifully crafted narrative about the twilight of their lives, the deep regrets of stubborn pride, and their desperate desire for one last chance to heal our fractured family. I sat completely still, letting their hollow words wash over me. I knew the financial noose I had tightened around Foxbridge Communities was cutting off their air supply. Their sudden onset of familiar love was nothing more than a symptom of impending bankruptcy. Then Dorian dropped the real bait. His voice dropped an octave, dripping with a manufactured sorrow. "We know the baby did not die. Lear," Dorian said softly. "We know you gave her up. We know her name is Cora, and we just want to meet our granddaughter before it is too late." The sheer audacity of the statement echoed through the quiet room. My face remained an unreadable mask, but beneath my ribs a cold, violent rage ignited. They had not just tracked me down. They had hunted my daughter. The adoption records were sealed by a strict federal mandate. The medical files were closed. There was absolutely no legal avenue for them to possess that information. Someone had breached a secure database, broken federal privacy laws, and sold my daughter's identity to the highest bidder. Lenora did not miss a beat. Recognizing that I was not reacting with the expected emotional breakdown, she shifted to the tactical phase of their visit. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, glossy presentation folder. She slid it across the glass coffee table toward me. The bold embossed logo of Ivory Anthem Strategy gleamed under the recessed lighting. It was one of the most ruthless, high-priced public relations crisis firms in the country. I opened the folder. The first page detailed a comprehensive media campaign titled A Journey of Family Reunion. It included mock-up press releases, scheduled philanthropic galas, and strategically planted magazine profiles. "Foxbridge has taken a hit in the press lately," Lenora explained, her voice entirely devoid of the motherly warmth she had faked just moments prior. "The market is shifting. Investors are becoming overly sensitive to corporate image. A narrative of reconciliation, of a family coming back together to build the future, would completely change the public perception." The strategy was sickeningly clear. They wanted to parade Cora in front of flashing cameras. They wanted to use the granddaughter they had once ordered me to abort as a shiny emotional prop to soften the hearts of their angry investors, the nervous residents of their failing properties, and the aggressive financial press. They intended to use my child as a human shield to save their collapsing empire. And then came the true purpose of their journey. Dorian cleared his throat, waving a hand dismissively, as if the next topic was merely an afterthought. "There is also a tiny piece of administrative housekeeping we need to clear up," Dorian said smoothly. "When your grandmother passed away, her estate transition was incredibly messy. There is a missing retroactive confirmation regarding the title transfer of the Belmere tract. It is just a minor clerical oversight, but our lenders are being incredibly pedantic. We have a massive creditor vote next week to approve a vital restructuring package. We just need your signature on a retroactive consent form to quiet the title and satisfy the board. They needed me to validate the forgery. They needed me to retroactively sign away the very land they had stolen from me 24 years ago, the land that currently served as the rotting foundation for their entire fraudulent enterprise. If I signed that paper, their crimes would be legally erased. The creditors would release the bailout funds and Foxbridge would survive. I did not throw the glossy folder back at them. I did not scream. I slowly closed the cover and stood up. Walking over to the kitchen island, I picked up a silver carafe and poured 3 cups of dark roast coffee. I carried the tray back to the sitting area. Moving with deliberate, measured slowness, I handed them their cups. I took a slow sip from mine, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the room became almost unbearable. "It is a lot to process," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, mimicking the hesitant vulnerability of a daughter desperate for approval. I was under the impression the hospital sealed everything permanently. "How did you even know she was a girl, let alone her name?" Dorian took a confident sip of his coffee, clearly believing he had successfully navigated the hardest part of the negotiation. His guard lowered significantly. "We hired top-tier investigators," Dorian replied casually. "They managed to pull some archived logs from the county health department. Your admission under maternal intake code 7 Delta 4 confirmed a live female birth, and they tracked the subsequent custodial transfer from there." My pulse did not jump, my hands did not tremble, but in the dark, calculating center of my mind, a heavy steel door slammed shut, locking him inside his own trap. Maternal intake code 7 Delta 4. That specific alphanumeric sequence was not a public directory term. It was not listed on any basic birth certificate or public health record. I knew this because I had spent the last decade tearing apart medical fraud cases. That sequence was a highly restricted internal billing identifier used exclusively by the state insurance portal. The only way Dorian Fox could know that exact code was if he had paid someone to illegally hack into a protected government medical database. He had just confessed to a federal cyber crime while sitting on my sofa. I looked down at the coffee in my cup, hiding the lethal sharpness in my eyes. I let out a soft, trembling breath, playing the perfect victim. "I need time," I whispered, staring at the glass table. "I cannot just sign legal documents or stand in front of cameras today. You have to give me a few days to think about this, to process the fact that you are actually here." Lenora smiled, a triumphant predatory curve of her lips. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Take all the time you need, sweetheart," Lenora said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We are staying at the Four Seasons downtown. We will wait for your call." They walked toward the door, their shoulders relaxed, their steps lighter. They believed they had won. They believed I was still the scared, desperate teenager looking for a scrap of validation from the parents who threw her away. Dorian opened the heavy door, giving me one last paternal nod before stepping out into the crisp Denver air. The door clicked shut, the heavy deadbolt engaging with a solid thud. I did not move for a long time. I stood in the empty foyer, listening to the silence of my fortress. Then I reached under the edge of the hallway console table and retrieved the small digital audio recorder I had activated the moment the perimeter alert sounded. I pressed the playback button. The audio was crystal clear. I fast-forwarded past the fake apologies and the PR pitch. I stopped the recording and pressed play. "We know her name is Cora, and we just want to meet our granddaughter before it is too late." The voice of the man who had ruined my youth echoed in the quiet space. I turned off the recorder and slipped it into my pocket. I looked at the spot on the sofa where they had been sitting. I was not going to give them a family reunion. I was going to give them an execution. The preparation was over. The war had officially begun. 72 hours after my parents walked out of my front door, the first explosive detonated. It did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the whisper networks of the Denver Financial District. My chief operating officer walked into my office, her face pale and her hands rigid, dropping a thick stack of printed financial blobs and private investor newsletters onto my desk. I was no longer the brilliant, untouchable founder of Iron Veil Claims Group. Almost overnight, I was being painted as a cold, calculating sociopath. The narrative was spinning violently out of control. Anonymous sources claimed I was a heartless woman who had abandoned an infant child to claw my way up the corporate ladder. Worse, the article suggested I was currently hiding a secret heir to manipulate offshore asset trusts and defraud my own equity partners. By the end of the business day, 3 of my largest institutional backers called to suspend our upcoming joint ventures. An altered, highly redacted version of my old hospital admission file had been delivered via encrypted email to their executive boards. The forged document implied a history of severe psychological instability and hidden financial liabilities tied to undisclosed family members. It was a surgical strike meant to my credibility before the massive creditor vote back in Kentucky. They wanted me terrified. They wanted me bleeding capital so fast that I would gladly sign their retroactive land deed just to make the nightmare stop and save my own firm. They fundamentally misunderstood the woman they were hunting. I did not call a public relations firm to defend my honor. I did not issue a frantic press release. I locked my office door, opened a secure terminal, and launched a massive digital counter-offensive. The anonymous emails carrying the medical files were routed through a maze of proxy servers in Eastern Europe, but whoever set up the dead drop was sloppy with the original metadata. Using the forensic tools I had built over the last decade, I extracted a string of hidden authorization tokens embedded deeply within the PDF properties. I traced the digital fingerprints straight back to a private top-tier security clearance log. The access code belonged directly to the senior legal counsel of Foxbridge Communities. From there, the data packet had been securely transmitted directly to the crisis management servers of Ivory Anthem Strategy. My father had paid an exorbitant fee to orchestrate my public execution using stolen medical data. I needed to know exactly how deep my father had dug into my past to construct this elaborate smear campaign. I initiated a deep dive into the historical wire transfers of the Foxbridge executive accounts, bypassing the current corporate shell companies and looking strictly at his personal slush funds from 2.5 decades ago. I was hunting for payments made to private investigators or early data brokers. Instead, I found a ghost. Staring back at me from the glowing screen was a sequence of 5 expedited wire transfers. The transactions occurred exactly 1 week after I was thrown out into the freezing Kentucky night. The recipient was Rowan Wren. Each transfer was for exactly $10,000. The breath left my lungs. The boy whose child I carried, the boy who had vanished into thin air while I was drowning in terror and medical debt, had not simply run away out of ordinary teenage cowardice. He had been bought. I deployed my top field investigator immediately. It took less than 48 hours to locate him. Rowan was living a quiet, invisible life on the dusty outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I did not send a proxy or a lawyer. I chartered a private flight the very next morning. I found him working in the back bay of a small sun-baked auto repair shop. The teenage boy with oil-stained hands was gone. In his place stood a weathered man in his early 40s, his hair graying heavily at the temples, his posture stooped under the invisible weight of a long-held shame. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag as I stepped into the dim light of the garage. He froze, the wrench in his hand clattered onto the concrete floor. He knew exactly who I was. The silence between us stretched for a long, agonizing minute before he finally dropped his gaze. We sat in a dingy diner down the road from the shop. He did not try to make excuses. He was sober, brutally honest, and deeply broken by the years. He did not just offer me $50,000 to disappear. Rowan told me, his voice barely a whisper over the mechanical hum of the ceiling fan. He threatened to completely destroy my entire family. My dad worked at the municipal utility plant. Your father promised to have him fired, blacklisted, and buried under fabricated theft charges. He told me if I'd ever came near you again, he would make sure my little sisters grew up sleeping on the sidewalk. I was a stupid, terrified kid. I took the money to save my family, and I ran. I sat across from him, feeling a strange, hollow numbness spreading through my chest. I had spent my entire adult life believing I was utterly unlovable, a piece of trash discarded by everyone, including the father of my child. I thought that was the absolute bottom of the betrayal. But Rowan was not finished. He reached into his worn canvas jacket and pulled out a small, tight bundle of papers wrapped in twine. He slid it across the sticky diner table. It was a collection of thick, weathered envelopes. I tried, he choked out, hot tears suddenly pooling in his tired eyes. The guilt ate me alive every single day. For the first entire year, I sent letters to the Briar Glen house. I sent envelopes of cash for my new job, hoping they would forward it to wherever you went. Every single one came back to me. I reached out and touched the bundle. I stared down at the envelopes. The handwriting was his, frantic and pleading. But across the front of each envelope, stamped in harsh red ink, were the words, "Return to sender," and written neatly beneath the stamp, in the elegant, unmistakable cursive of Lenora Fox, was a single, devastating sentence. No one by this name lies at this address. My mother had intercepted every single letter. She had taken the cash, sealed the envelopes back up, and sent them away. It was not enough for them to throw me out to protect their brand. It was not enough to steal my grandmother's land. Lenora had actively, systematically starved me of any potential emotional support. She wanted to ensure I was completely severed from the world, isolated and destroyed. She wanted to cut off any possibility that I could still be loved, hoping the streets would finish the job she started. The eviction from my childhood home was never a sudden fiery explosion of moral outrage over a teenage pregnancy. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. It was a cold, calculated Militarira campaign of total erasure. They had sanitized the crime scene to steal my inheritance, paid off the only person who might have looked for me, and built a massive, impenetrable wall of silence around my existence. I left the diner and flew back to Denver in absolute silence. Late that night, I stood alone in my office, the city lights glowing through the glass walls. I took a pair of scissors and carefully cut the twine binding the bundle Rowan had given me. I lined up the returned letters, one by one, across the pristine surface of my desk. I stared down at the faded ink, the desperate pleas of a scared boy, and the cruel, elegant cursive of my mother denying my very existence. I was not looking at old mail. I was looking at the exhumed bones of a stolen life. They had hunted me for 24 years, trying to erase me from the earth, but the hunt was officially over. I was the predator now. My secure private line rang just past midnight. The caller identification displayed an encrypted number, but the voice that came through the receiver was unmistakable. It belonged to the golden child of the Fox dynasty. My brother Beckett spoke in a rushed, hushed tone, completely stripped of the arrogant swagger he carried in his youth. He told me Foxbridge Communities was drowning in an ocean of toxic debt, and that he wanted to stand on the right side of history before the entire ship sank to the bottom. I knew my brother. Beckett had not suddenly grown a moral conscience overnight. He was a coward who had realized the structural integrity of his luxurious lifestyle was collapsing, and he was desperately looking for a lifeboat. I agreed to meet him, not out of sibling affection, but solely to extract the internal company data I needed to complete my arsenal. We met in the dimly lit corner booth of a high-end discreet steakhouse on the outskirts of the city. Beckett looked terrible. His expensive cashmere coat could not hide the dark circles under his eyes or the slight tremor in his hands. He slid a sleek encrypted flash drive across the polished mahogany table. In exchange for the data, he wanted my guarantee that I would leave his personal asset management firm out of my crosshairs when the federal indictments inevitably came down. He spilled the final details of my father's desperate survival strategy. Dorian was organizing a massive event he called the Legacy Renewal Gala. It was scheduled to take place in exactly 3 weeks at the Grand Ballroom of the most expensive hotel in Kentucky. The gala was designed to be a spectacular theater production for the local press, the municipal zoning boards, and a syndicate of private equity investors. My father intended to sell the narrative of a beautiful, healed family reunion. He planned to use the emotional leverage of bringing his long-lost daughter and newfound granddaughter back into the fold to secure an emergency cash injection and reassure the terrified residents who had already bought units in his new flagship nursing home project. I took the flash drive, gave Beckett a cold, non-committal nod, and walked out into the night. The next morning, I flew Otisar out from Colorado. I had hired a private security detail to escort us to a highly secure depository vault at a private regional bank. For 24 years, I had carried the tarnished brass key my grandmother Maeve had pressed into my palm. It belonged to a safety deposit box registered under a dormant, secondary maiden name Maeve had maintained precisely to hide it from her son. We sat in a sterile, windowless viewing room deep inside the bank vault, the steel door sealed shut behind us with a heavy airtight hiss. I placed the long metal box onto the steel table. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady during hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive courtroom battles, finally trembled as I turned the brass key in the lock. The lid popped open. The air inside smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper. Inside the box lay the original unaltered quartile to her will. But beneath the legal documents lay something far more devastating. There was a handwritten letter penned by Maeve accompanied by a thick leather-bound ledger filled with columns of names, dates, and parcel numbers. I unfolded the letter. Maeve had written it just weeks before her heart failed. Her elegant, sweeping cursive detailed a terrifying truth. She had legally transferred the Belmere tract to me, not simply as an act of familial love, but as a desperate blockade. She explicitly stated her profound suspicion that Dorian had been systematically embezzling equity and committing predatory land theft for years. She knew the Belmere land was the absolute geographical key to his future expansion plans, and she put it in my name to stop him from building a fraudulent empire. I passed the leather-bound ledger to Otisar. As she ran her calloused fingers over the faded ink of the transaction logs, her face drained of all color, her breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound breaking the absolute silence of the vault room. She pointed to a specific sequence of names from the late 1980s. They were all elderly widows and struggling minority families who had lost their properties to Dorian under highly suspicious foreclosure proceedings. Otisar closed her eyes, and a heavy, sorrowful truth finally broke free from her chest. She confessed a secret she had buried for decades. Long before she ran the boarding house in Denver, Otisar had lived in Kentucky. She had worked as a senior closing agent in a municipal title office that handled the early land acquisitions for my father. She had witnessed firsthand how Dorian bribed local officials to artificially deflate property taxes on vulnerable homeowners, forcing them into default so he could purchase their land for a fraction of its true value. When Otisar gathered the courage to report him, Dorian had sent men to her house in the middle of the night. They broke her windows and promised to burn her alive if she ever spoke a word. That was the real reason she had fled halfway across the country, dedicating the rest of her life to sheltering women who had been broken by cruel men. The revelation hit me with a sickening poetic gravity. The woman who had saved my life when my father threw me away had been a victim of his ruthlessness long before I ever was. We returned to my office and decrypted the files Beckett had provided. The data elevated my investigation from a case of financial fraud to an impending humanitarian disaster. I had previously discovered the foundation issues at the new Foxbridge nursing home, but Beckett had delivered the definitive smoking gun. He provided the direct internal email chains. My father had received the catastrophic structural engineering reports explicitly detailing the severe subsidence and the fatal stress fractures in the load-bearing walls. Instead of halting the project, Dorian had personally signed the executive orders to bury the reports, fire the original engineering firm, and hire a corrupt inspector to sign off on a falsified safety certificate. This was no longer just about a stolen inheritance or a vindictive eviction. The scope of the crime had expanded far beyond the borders of my own personal trauma. Hundreds of elderly, vulnerable citizens were preparing to move their entire lives into a building that was mathematically guaranteed to collapse. If I stayed silent, if I merely focused on my own quiet revenge, innocent people would pay for the sins of my parents with their lives. The sheer weight of the responsibility settled heavily onto my shoulders. I had the forgery. I had the illegal medical data breaches. I had the proof of the deadly construction cover-up. I possessed enough ammunition to level the Foxbridge empire to ash. However, I could not fire the weapon yet. If I stood up at that garler and presented the evidence alone, Dorian and his army of public relations mercenaries would immediately spin the narrative. They would paint me as a bitter, estranged daughter fabricating evidence to destroy the family out of sheer spite. The media would devour the story as a subjective, messy family drama, entirely missing the actual criminal danger. I needed a witness who was completely clean. I needed a voice so undeniably pure and detached from the toxic history of the Fox family that no lawyer or journalist could possibly question their motives. Without that final crucial piece, the entire counterattack could fail. I sat back in my chair, staring at the scattered documents, the ancient ledger, and the horrifying engineering reports. Odisser stood up from the leather sofa. She walked over to my desk and placed her large, weathered hand firmly on top of the towering stack of evidence. "Now you do not just have pain," Odisser said, her voice carrying the deep, resonant strength of a woman who had survived the absolute worst of the world. "You have history, and this history knows how to speak." I drove up the winding highway toward Boulder, the afternoon sun casting long, sharp shadows across the rugged foothills. I was on my way to meet the one person who held the power to either save my soul or completely shatter it. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, a stark contrast to the absolute calm I projected in every other area of my life. I parked outside a quiet, sunlit cafe constructed of reclaimed wood and expansive glass. I took a deep, steadying breath and walked through the doors. Carhart was sitting at a corner table, her head bowed over a digital drafting tablet. She was 24 years old, a brilliant, fiercely independent structural designer who dedicated her career to the rehabilitation of low-income community housing. Looking at her, I saw echoes of my own determination, but her edges were softer, warmed by a lifetime of genuine affection that I had never known at her age. The greatest twist of my entire existence was that our meeting today was not a dramatic, tear-filled revelation. For the past 2 years, I did not have to wonder what she looked like or if she hated me. When Carr turned 22, adhering strictly to the unyielding legal stipulations of our open adoption agreement, Odisser had personally traveled to meet her. Odisser delivered the heavy locked steel box containing the letters I had written to her every single year since her birth. Cora had read every single word of my struggles, my quiet victories, and my absolute devotion. She had reached out to me shortly after. Our reunions over the past 2 years had never been explosive or filled with cinematic weeping embraces. They were quiet, cautious, and profoundly respectful. We were two adult women slowly learning the shape of each other, building a fragile bridge across a massive canyon of lost time. She called Nora and Sealers her parents, and I would never dream of taking that sacred title away from the beautiful people who raised her. To Cora, I was a guardian angel who had finally stepped out of the shadows, a biological mother who had fought the world to ensure she had a safe place to sleep. I sat down in the chair across from her. She looked up, offering a warm, genuine smile that instantly settled the nervous rhythm of my heart. I ordered a black tea, and without any dramatic build-up, I laid out the entire situation regarding Dorian and Lenora. I explained the upcoming Garler, the manufactured public relations strategy, and my parents' desperate, sickening need to parade her in front of the media to save their crumbling corporate reputation. Cora set her digital pen down on the table. Her eyes, a sharp and intelligent brown, hardened immediately. She possessed an inner steel that mirrored my own, but it was anchored by a profound sense of self-worth. She told me in no uncertain terms that she absolutely refused to be used as a human prop. She would never allow Dorian and Lenora to weaponize her existence to salvage their toxic brand. She found the very concept of their sudden obsession with sacred bloodlines deeply repulsive. They were strangers who had demanded her erasure, and she felt zero obligation to play the role of the prodigal granddaughter. Then the conversation shifted, and Cora delivered a piece of information that made the air in the cafe stand entirely still. When I mentioned the specific name of the new Foxbridge assisted living facility, Cora pulled up a heavily encrypted file on her tablet. A few months prior, her structural design firm had been brought in to consult on a secondary satellite bidding package for the facility's perimeter retaining walls. While reviewing the topography surveys and the soil composition logs, She had noticed glaring, terrifying anomalies in the foundational load calculations. She had flagged the project for critical structural risks, suspecting the primary contractors were actively burying evidence of severe soil subsidence. Her superiors had dismissed her concerns because Foxbridge had already secured municipal approval, but Cora had quietly kept copies of the preliminary data. My daughter, the infant I had given away to keep safe, was holding the exact mathematical proof needed to expose my father's deadliest lie. We left the cafe with a unified, terrifying purpose. Cora made her conditions absolutely clear before getting into her car. She would join the fight, but she was not interested in a messy, vindictive family revenge plot. She was stepping onto the battlefield strictly to protect the elderly residents who were blindly preparing to move into a collapsing death trap. I agreed instantly. I returned to Denver and transformed the executive boardroom of Iron Veil Claims Group into a war room. I assembled the most lethal clinical team I could find. Tamsin Reed, my most aggressive and terrifying litigation attorney, took the head of the long glass table. Jude Morrow, a forensic cash flow expert who could track a single hidden dollar through a maze of international offshore accounts, sat to her right. Odisser and Rowan arrived later that evening, bringing the undeniable weight of their historical testimonies. We divided our massive counter-offensive into 3 distinct surgical strikes. Tamsin and I would handle the legal execution regarding the stolen Belmare tract, preparing the civil injunctions and the criminal fraud referrals. Jude and a team of forensic data technicians would trace the illegal cyber breach of the sealed medical and adoption records directly back to the Foxbridge executive suite, preparing a massive federal privacy lawsuit. Finally, Cora, working quietly alongside our independent structural engineers, would finalize the irrefutable evidence that Dorian was knowingly building a catastrophic hazard, preparing to drop the information directly onto the desks of the state housing inspectors. To spring the trap perfectly, I had to make my parents believe I was willingly walking into it. I had to play the role of the emotionally exhausted daughter who was finally ready to surrender to the overwhelming pressure of her powerful family. I retreated to my private office and drafted a carefully worded email to Lenora and Dorian. I wrote that I was exhausted from fighting the public smear campaign. I lied and said that the media pressure was hurting my firm and that I was open to discussing their journey of family reunion campaign to make the bleeding stop. I explicitly requested that they send over the entire public relations script, the Garler itinerary, and the retroactive confirmation documents they needed me to sign. I needed them to put their entire fraudulent scheme in writing. Sending it directly from their corporate servers to my inbox, I hit send, knowing they would take the bait. They always believed they were the smartest people in the room. Late that night, long after the war room had emptied and the city outside my window had gone dark, I sat alone at my desk. A notification pinged loudly on my high-resolution monitor. It was an email from the Foxbridge legal department marked urgent and highly confidential. I opened the encrypted attachment. It was the retroactive consent form for the Bellman land transfer, the vital document required to quiet the title and release their emergency bailout funds from the aggressive creditors. I slowly scrolled down to the bottom of the page to review the signature line. My breath caught in my throat, not from shock, but from the sheer unadulterated audacity of the man who shared my blood. The signature line was not blank. Dorian had not even waited for me to capitulate. Attached to the digital document, flawlessly rendered and ready for final notary stamping, was a perfect digital replica of my signature. He had assumed I would eventually cave to the pressure, but just in case I delayed or tried to negotiate, he had already committed a second highly documented act of forgery. He had learned absolutely nothing in 24 years. If he could not trick me into surrendering, he would simply forge my existence to serve his needs. I stared at the fake ink glowing on the screen, a cold, dangerous smile slowly spreading across my face. He thought he was forcing my hand, but he had just handed me the final, irrefutable nail for his own coffin. I possessed every single document required to obliterate Foxbridge communities behind the closed mahogany doors of a federal courthouse. A quiet legal victory was entirely within my grasp. I had the fraudulent transfer of the Beller tract, the illegal data breaches, and the suppressed engineering reports. I could have filed a massive civil suit, secured a gag order, and watched my father bleed millions of dollars in a private settlement. However, I knew exactly how wealthy men survived the justice system. A courtroom would provide Dorian with a sterile environment where he could hire the most expensive crisis managers and defense attorneys in the country. He would manipulate the proceedings, drag out the litigation for a decade, and effortlessly twist the narrative to the press. He would play the tragic, heartbroken patriarch, painting me as a vindictive, unstable daughter who fabricated corporate espionage to destroy her own flesh and blood out of pure, unadulterated spite. He would survive the scandal, declare a strategic bankruptcy, and retire to a quiet life of luxury. I could not allow him that luxury. I decided the execution had to be a public, inescapable spectacle. I chose the Legacy Renewal Gala as the primary battlefield. It was the absolute perfect trap. Every single entity my father intended to deceive would be trapped inside one single ballroom. The private equity investors holding his debt, the municipal housing inspectors, the terrified future residents of the nursing home, the regional credit board, and the local press corps would all be holding crystal champagne flutes waiting for his triumphant speech. I was going to walk into his coronation and turn it into a slaughterhouse. The psychological pressure mounted to a suffocating level as the clock ticked down to the final 24 hours before the event. Dorian grew frantic when I refused to answer his calls or sign the forged retroactive consent form. By mid-morning, he deployed a secure corporate courier to my office, delivering a brutal typed ultimatum. The letter stated that if I did not sign the documents and publicly agree to the family reunion by noon the following day, he would release the entirely unredacted adoption files to every major media outlet in the state. He threatened to spin a sickening fabricated story. He would tell the world I was a heartless, ambitious monster who threw away a newborn infant simply to pursue a selfish corporate career, positioning himself as the benevolent grandfather who had spent 2 decades desperately searching for the child I discarded. Just 3 hours later, Lenore left a voicemail on my private line. She attempted to play the role of the loving, concerned mother. Her tone dripped with a saccharine, manufactured sweetness as she begged me to do the right thing and come home to save the family legacy. But the pressure was cracking her pristine facade, and the mask finally slipped. Frustrated by my absolute silence, her voice tightened into a vicious, impatient sneer right before the recording ended. She hissed into the receiver, telling me to just sign the damn paper because they were out of time, and she refused to let her entire life be ruined over that girl. That girl. 2 simple, venomous words that laid bare her rotting soul. In the darkest corner of her heart, she did not view Cora as a granddaughter. She viewed her as a pest, a bargaining chip, a necessary evil to keep her country club membership and her imported cars intact. Inside the war room of Iron Veil Claims Group, the final pieces of our armory were locked into place. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of high-resolution monitors. Rowan Wren sat across from my lead litigator, Tamsin Reed, and signed a comprehensive sworn affidavit under the strict penalty of perjury. He detailed the exact amounts of the bribes Dorian had paid him, the specific threats made against his father and his younger sisters, and his forced exile from the state of Kentucky. Odisser stood beside him, her face a mask of fierce concentration. She meticulously cross-referenced every single date, bank transfer, and flight record, ensuring our timeline was absolutely bulletproof. She left zero room for the opposing counsel to breathe or find a single loophole in our narrative. Meanwhile, the Fox family was actively cannibalizing itself from the inside out. Beckett, utterly panicked by the impending financial collapse he sensed on the horizon, attempted to play both sides of the war to save his own skin. My forensic cash flow expert, Jude Morrow, intercepted encrypted digital communications, proving my brother was actively trying to sell the exact same cache of internal Foxbridge engineering reports to an aggressive New York hedge fund. Beckett was hoping to secure a massive golden parachute for his own private firm before his father filed for bankruptcy. It was the ultimate pathetic proof that the dynasty my parents had sacrificed me to build was completely devoid of loyalty. They were a pack of starving animals ready to tear each other apart just to survive the winter. As the afternoon sky darkened into a bruised, heavy purple, a sudden crisis threatened to shatter the emotional foundation of our entire plan. Cora arrived at my office, her face pale, her posture rigid with an anxiety I had never seen in her before. The terrifying reality of the impending media explosion had finally hit her. She paced across the plush carpet, her voice trembling as she confessed her deepest fear. She was terrified that a highly publicized, vicious scandal would deeply traumatize Nora and Sealer's heart, the gentle, private people who had actually raised her with unconditional love and quiet dignity. She did not want their peaceful lives dragged through the toxic radioactive mud of my family history. A wave of profound maternal instinct washed over me, sharp and absolute. The old Aaliyah, the one raised by the manipulative tactics of Dorian and Lenora, would have used guilt or anger to force her compliance. I could have reminded her of the residents in danger, leveraging her morality to push her onto that stage, but I was not my parents. I refused to treat my daughter like a pawn on a chessboard. I walked over to her, looking directly into her intelligent brown eyes, and told her to go home. I kept my voice incredibly soft but entirely firm. I assured her that her absolute priority should always be the family that loved and protected her, not the brutal war I was fighting. I told her that if she chose not to attend the gala, I would step onto that stage completely alone and burn the empire to the ground with my own 2 hands. I did not beg. I did not press. I let her walk out the glass doors of my office, releasing my grip entirely, proving to both of us that I had finally broken the generational curse of the Fox family. I knew how to let go. The night of the gala arrived with the cold, sharp precision of a guillotine blade. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my private dressing room, adjusting the collar of a perfectly tailored, razor-sharp black suit. I wore no jewelry, no bright colors, no soft fabrics. It was not a dress for a celebration. It was armor for a funeral. My phone buzzed on the marble vanity. I picked it up and read a single short text message from Cora. I will be there, but I'm stepping out for the truth, not for the Fox name. A fierce, incredibly proud heat bloomed in the center of my chest. I turned off the screen, walked out of the building, and stepped into the back of a waiting town car. The drive to the venue was a silent, dark blur of city lights and cold anticipation. The heady black vehicle finally rolled to a smooth halt in front of the grand entrance of the luxury hotel. Dozens of valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open doors for the local elite. Camera flashes illuminated the red carpet as the wealthy residents of the city filed into the grand ballroom, their laughter echoing in the crisp night air. I sat in the darkness of the back seat for one final moment, looking through the tinted window at the glowing glass doors of the venue. Behind those doors, my parents were preparing to host a spectacular, fraudulent reunion to save their life's work. They had no idea that the daughter they threw out into the rain had just arrived to execute them. The ballroom was bathed in a warm golden light. A string quartet played soft, inviting melodies from the corner of the room, wrapping the massive space in a thick blanket of manufactured elegance. Massive projection screens hung above the main stage, displaying a carefully edited, highly sanitized video montage of the Fox family history. I stood hidden in the darkened wings of the stage, watching my father step up to the crystal podium. Dorian wore his signature custom-tailored tuxedo, looking every inch the benevolent, wise patriarch. He adjusted the microphone, his voice echoing across the silent room with a practiced, sickening sincerity. He spoke to the crowd of wealthy investors, local politicians, and nervous nursing home residents about the beauty of second chances, the enduring power of faith, and the miraculous return of things that were once considered lost. He was setting the stage for his grand salvation. He took a dramatic pause, preparing to announce to the world that I had returned to forgive him, that the Belmure land dispute was officially resolved, and that our family was finally whole again with the discovery of his long-lost granddaughter. Before he could utter my name, I gave the visual signal to my technical team secured in the sound booth above. The warm string music was violently severed, replaced by a sharp, jarring crackle of static that made the guests flinch. The massive projection screens behind Dorian went pitch black. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of socialites and executives. Then the screens flared back to life, flooding the extravagant room with the glaring, undeniable white light of scanned legal documents. The original unaltered Cortal of Mayfox appeared, projected 30 high. Beside it flashed the topographical map of the Beller Tract, followed quickly by the county notary log, a certified delivery receipt, and finally a massive forensic comparison of the forged guardianship document next to my actual teenage handwriting. I walked out from the shadows and stepped directly into the blinding spotlight. I did not run. I did not tremble. I did not raise my voice. My sharp black suit absorbed the stage lights as I walked right up to the podium and took the microphone directly from my father's frozen hand. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. I looked out at the sea of bewildered faces. I stated clearly that Foxbridge Communities was not built by the brilliant business acumen or the hard work of the man standing beside me. It was built on a foundation of calculated theft. It was built on the stolen inheritance of a 17-year-old girl who was thrown out into the freezing rain to cover up the crime. Dorian snapped out of his shock and panicked. He lunged toward a secondary microphone on the panel table, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple. He tried to twist the narrative exactly as I knew he would, desperately a tale of a troubled family, begging the audience not to let private emotional pain overshadow decades of community building. He called me confused and deeply hurt. I was not fighting this battle alone from the front row. Tamsin Reed stood up. She did not yell. She simply raised her hand, signaling the booth to cast the forensic cybersecurity logs onto the main screens. The logs clearly displayed the illegal unauthorized access to my sealed hospital admission records originating directly from the Foxbridge executive suite. Immediately after, Jude Marrero stood up, projecting the exact financial wire transfers that flowed from Dorian's private accounts straight to Ivory Anthem's strategy to fund the fake family reunion campaign. The false narrative of the heartbroken grandfather evaporated into thin air in real time. The investors in the room began to murmur, the noise swelling into a chaotic, angry hum, but the final fatal blow was yet to come. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung wide open. Cara Hart walked down the center aisle. She moved with a quiet, undeniable grace, her chin held high, her eyes focused strictly on the stage. She did not walk toward my father. She did not even glance at Lenora, who was currently gripping the edge of her table as if the floor was dropping out from under her feet. Carr walked directly onto the stage and stood firmly beside me and Otisser. Cora leaned into my microphone. She confirmed her identity to the massive room, stating clearly that she was indeed my biological daughter. But she declared with absolute conviction that her true family, the people who raised her with actual love and unwavering devotion, were Nora and Sealer's Hart. She told the crowd that the Fox family only sought her out because they desperately needed a clean, sympathetic face to patch up their filthy, rotting corporate image. She refused to be their pawn. Then Cora delivered the final execution order. She pulled out the independent structural engineering assessment of the new Foxbridge Assisted Living Facility, the catastrophic soil subsidence data, and the load-bearing stress fracture reports flashed onto the massive screens above us. Carr explained the mathematics of the disaster to the horrified room. She exposed the fact that Dorian knew the building was structurally compromised and actively chose to hide the danger to secure his bailout funding, knowingly preparing to push hundreds of elderly residents into a fatal hazard just to save his own wallet. The ballroom detonated. The polite whispers turned into an uproar of absolute chaos. Members of the regional credit board stood up, shouting into their mobile phones to freeze the emergency bailout votes immediately. Terrified residents who had put life savings down as deposits on the nursing home rushed toward the stage, demanding answers and their money back. The local press corps pushed forward, a blinding storm of camera flashes capturing every single second of the destruction. Dorian completely lost whatever remained of his manufactured composure. He grabbed the secondary microphone and began screaming a string of vicious, hateful curses at me, his face contorted with rage, accidentally broadcasting his true venomous nature to the entire room and destroying the last microscopic shred of his moral facade. Lenora sank slowly into her chair, burying her face in her trembling hands, finally realizing that no amount of money or public relations spin could save them from the wreckage. Over the deafening roar of the crowd, a heavy thud of the ballroom doors opening again echoed through the space. A coordinated task force of financial crime investigators accompanied by State Housing Authority inspectors marched down the aisle holding thick manila folders containing federal search and seizure warrants. They moved straight toward the executive tables. In the weeks that followed the Garler, the Foxbridge empire was completely dismantled. The corporation was forced into immediate receivership, its assets frozen and liquidated to pay off the massive mountain of fraudulent debt. Beckett found himself entirely entangled in a separate brutal federal investigation regarding his own illicit property appraisals and internal kickbacks. As for the Bellamy Tract, I did not keep it to build my own fortune. Through the civil restitution settlements I won against my father, I established the Maid Housing Trust. We transformed the land and the recovered funds into a massive, heavily endowed foundation dedicated entirely to providing secure housing, legal protection, and comprehensive support for young single mothers and women who had been abandoned by their families. I did not try to reclaim my childhood bedroom. I did not fight to redeem the Fox family name. I let the ashes of that legacy blow away in the wind. On a quiet, sunny afternoon in Denver, I stood on the porch of my home. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, tarnished brass of my grandmother's key. It was the only thing I had ever kept from that house. I looked out at the lawn where Carr was laughing brightly alongside Nora and Sealers, while Otisser sat on a nearby bench, a rare, genuine smile softening her weathered face. They were my true family, bound not by the rigid, toxic expectations of blood, but by the conscious, beautiful choice to stay. The door that threw me out at 17 years old had finally come back looking for me, but this time it no longer had the power to decide who I was. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments below where you are listening to this story from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button, so the story in this video can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.